The door didn't slam. That was the worst part. Claudette Weston simply set the last bag down on the snow-dusted porch, turned the new key in the lock, and walked back inside without a word. Through the frosted window, warm golden light flickered. Laughter drifted out Derek's laugh, easy and unbothered. Music, the clink of glasses. Kelsey stood in the January cold, 6 days postpartum, holding Wren against her chest. She didn't knock. She didn't call his name. She just looked down at her daughter's sleeping face, so small, so completely unaware, then looked back up at that glowing window, and something in her went very, very still. They don't know, she thought. They have absolutely no idea. If this story already has your heart racing, drop your country and the time where you are right now in the comments. I want to know who's watching with me tonight. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button. This one is going to be worth staying for. 6 days earlier, the snow hadn't started yet. The hospital room on the 4th floor of Mercy General smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, the kind of smell that clings to the back of your throat, no matter how many times you swallow. Kelsey was propped up against 3 pillows, her hospital gown still damp at the collar, her locks loosened from the bun she'd worn into the delivery room 14 hours ago. Her body ached in ways she hadn't prepared herself for, deep, bone-level exhaustion, the kind that arrives after something enormous has passed through you and left you hollowed out and strangely sacred at the same time. Wren was asleep on her chest. 6 pounds, 4 ounces, a full head of dark hair, fingers so small, Kelsey kept counting them over and over just to feel them curl. Her phone buzzed on the bedside tray. Patricia Wells didn't knock when she entered. She never did in moments like this. She simply walked in, pulled the chair close to the bed, sat down, and opened her leather portfolio without preamble. That was the thing about Patricia. She understood that some of the most important business in the world got done in the quietest rooms. Singapore confirmed, Patricia said, her voice low, her eyes moving from the documents to Kelsey's face. Tokyo signed off 20 minutes ago. The board in London ratified it at 6 this morning their time. She paused. It's done, Kelsey. Kelsey didn't look up from Wren's face right away. Then slowly she reached across to the bedside tray, picked up the tablet Patricia had already unlocked, and read through the final page of the agreement one more time. Not because she doubted it, because she had learned over 7 years to never let a number that large pass through her hands without looking it directly in the eye. $44 billion. KBI Holdings, the company she had incorporated quietly 7 years ago in a small office above a dry cleaning shop on Mercer Street, with a second-hand desk and a conviction that the American healthcare infrastructure was sitting on a catastrophic inefficiency that no one in power wanted to admit had just closed the largest AI healthcare infrastructure deal in the history of private enterprise. She signed. The stylus barely made a sound. Congratulations, Patricia said simply. Kelsey handed the tablet back, looked down at Wren, and exhaled long and slow, like a woman setting down something she'd carried for a very long time. What Derek didn't know, what he had never once thought to ask, was that while he was downstairs that morning, telling his mother that Kelsey needed to be out of this house within the week, his wife had just become one of the most significant signatories in global financial history. He had never Googled her full name. Not once. Not in 3 years of marriage. She had counted on that. By the time Kelsey was discharged and brought Wren home on a Tuesday afternoon, the house on Alderton Drive already felt different. She'd noticed it in the small ways first, the way Claudette moved through the kitchen without acknowledging her, the way Derek's voice went flat. When she entered a room, the way Tara Osie's name started appearing on his phone screen, with a frequency that wasn't new, but had stopped being hidden. He had gotten careless, or maybe he had simply stopped caring about being careful. That Tuesday night, Kelsey sat in the nursery. She had painted herself a soft sage green, with a wooden mobile of tiny birds above the crib, and nursed Wren in the dark. She could hear Derek downstairs on the phone, his voice low and warm, in a way it hadn't been with her in over a year. She didn't cry. She sat and she listened, and she filed it away somewhere precise and purposeful in the back of her mind. She had not built a $44 billion company by reacting before she was ready. The night Claudette changed the locks 6 days after Wren was born, the house on Alderton Drive was lit up from every window. Derek had told Kelsey that morning that the family needed to talk. She had assumed it meant dinner, perhaps a confrontation she had been quietly preparing for. Instead, she came home from a postpartum checkup to find her key no longer worked, 3 bags of her clothing stacked on the snow-dusted porch, and the muffled sound of a celebration happening on the other side of a door that used to be hers. Inside, Claudette was pouring champagne. Tara sat in the armchair by the fireplace, the one Kelsey had reupholstered herself the previous spring, wearing a dress the color of fresh blood and holding a glass with both hands like it already belonged to her. Derek was laughing at something his younger brother set his jacket off his tie, loosened his posture, entirely unburdened. On the kitchen counter, half hidden beneath a dish towel, sat a velvet box. Inside it, Claudette's pearl and diamond engagement ring, a piece the older woman had described more than once as reserved only for a woman worthy of this family. Not one person in that house had thought to wonder where Kelsey was. Not one person had considered that the woman they just locked out into the January cold, still healing, still bleeding, still producing milk for a 6-day-old child, might be more than what they had decided she was. What she had always been in their eyes was ordinary. A woman Derek had inexplicably chosen. A woman with no family name they recognized, no connections they could leverage, no fortune to speak of. Claudette had said it plainly once at a dinner Kelsey was meant to be too far away to hear he could have done so much better. They had built their entire strategy around that assumption. It was the most expensive mistake any of them would ever make. That night, from the parking lot of the Alderton Extended Stay Hotel 2 miles away, Kelsey sat in the driver's seat with Ren strapped into the infant carrier across her chest. The heat was running. The snow was coming down in earnest now, thick, silent, blanketing everything in a false kind of peace. She opened her laptop, not to cry, not to draft a message to Derek, not to call anyone and describe what had just happened to her. She opened the KBI Holdings internal dashboard and began reviewing the integration timeline for the Singapore rollout. Her fingers were steady, her mind was clear, and somewhere across the city, in a house full of warm light and champagne, and the dangerous comfort of a decision they believed was already settled, no one had any idea that the woman they had just dismissed was at that very moment deciding exactly how this would end. They have no idea what they just did, Patricia had said 6 days ago in that quiet hospital room. She had been right. They never did. There is a particular kind of invisibility that ambitious women learn to wear. Not the invisibility of being overlooked, though, that comes too reliably painfully, but the deliberate kind, the chosen kind, the kind where you understand early and clearly that the world will underestimate you whether you want it to or not, and so you decide quietly to let it. Kelsey Brooks had been wearing that invisibility for 7 years. She had incorporated KBI Holdings on a Thursday morning in March, 6 months before she met Derek Weston at a rooftop fundraiser in Midtown. The company existed as 3 things at that point: a name on a filing, a second-hand desk, in a sublet office above a dry cleaning shop on Mercer Street, and an idea so large and so specific that she had stopped trying to explain it to people at dinner parties. The idea was simple in the way that only genuinely transformative ideas are simple once someone finally says them out loud. American healthcare infrastructure was drowning in fragmentation. Hospital systems that couldn't speak to each other. Insurance networks running on software built in the 90s. Patient records scattered across 17 incompatible platforms. Billions of dollars hemorrhaging every year into inefficiencies that no one in a position of power wanted to be the one to fix, because fixing them required admitting first that the system was broken in ways that reflected badly on the people who had been running it. Kelsey had spent 4 years working inside that system, first as a data analyst at a regional hospital group, then as a consultant for a healthcare technology firm that talked loudly about innovation and moved with the urgency of a glacier. She had built models, written reports, flagged the same problems in meeting after meeting, and watched her recommendations get filed into folders that no one reopened. So she stopped waiting for permission. She took her savings, $34,000, most of it from 3 years of living below her means, signed a 12-month lease on that Mercer Street office, and began building KBI Holdings from the ground up. An AI-driven infrastructure layer that could sit beneath existing hospital systems and make them communicate, not replace them, not disrupt them in the way that Silicon Valley loved to disrupt things loudly and with a great deal of press coverage, just quietly, precisely make them work. It took 2 years before the first health network agreed to a pilot program. It took another 18 months before the results were significant enough that larger systems started calling her. She did not celebrate loudly. She did not post about it. She hired, carefully kept her team small and devoted, and structured the company's ownership in a way that Patricia Wells, whom she had met at a Women in Finance conference and recognized immediately as someone who understood both law and discretion, helped her make airtight. KBI Holdings was hers. Completely, legally, irrevocably hers. She met Derek Weston at the fundraiser on a warm April evening, and she had liked him genuinely in the beginning. He was charming in the easy way of men who have always been told they are remarkable. He was handsome. He laughed loudly and without self-consciousness, and in the first months that laugh had felt like oxygen in rooms that had been too serious for too long. He worked in financial services mid-level, though he described it with the vocabulary of someone considerably higher, and he moved through the world with the unexamined confidence of a man who had never had a door close in his face. She had not told him about KBI Holdings on their first date, or their 5th, or the night he proposed 14 months later on the rooftop of the same building where they had met. She had told Patricia instead, and Patricia had nodded slowly and said, "You want the prenup to reflect the existing structure." It wasn't a question. "Yes," Kelsey said, "exactly." Derek signed the prenuptial agreement 3 weeks before the wedding. He signed it the way men like Derek signed documents they had already decided were formalities, quickly with a pen that cost more than the signing deserved, not reading past the first page because reading carefully would have implied that he had something to worry about. He assumed the agreement was there to protect his family's assets. The Westons had a name, a reputation, a network. Surely if anyone needed protecting in this arrangement, it was them. He never considered that it might be the other way around. In the years that followed, KBI Holdings grew steadily and without announcement. Kelsey worked from a home office she had converted from a spare bedroom, a room Derek had once suggested with genuine innocence might make a good nursery eventually. She kept her hours fluid, her calls scheduled for when Derek was at the office or out with clients, her travel described vaguely as consulting work, for a company she named when pressed with the kind of forgettable specificity that people accepted without curiosity. Derek accepted it without curiosity. That she came to understand was not cruelty. It was something quieter and in its own way more complete. He simply was not interested in her professional life because he had decided somewhere early in their marriage that it was not significant. The assumption was never stated outright. It lived instead in the way he interrupted her when she was on calls, in the way he described her at dinner parties. Kelsey does some tech work, nothing too demanding, with the cheerful confidence of a man summarizing something he understood. In the way he stopped asking about her day, not with hostility, but with the comfortable disregard of someone who had already concluded that the answer would not be interesting. She had watched all of it, filed all of it, let all of it pass without correction, because she had learned in 7 years of building something the world would eventually have to take seriously that the most dangerous thing she could do was show her hand before the moment was right. The moment, it turned out, arrived on a Tuesday in February in a hospital room, smelling of antiseptic and recycled air, with a 6-pound daughter asleep on her chest and a tablet in her hand, and $44 billion quietly redistributing itself across the global financial landscape. Derek had been at the hospital for the birth. He had held Ren for approximately 4 minutes before his phone rang, and he stepped into the hallway and then stepped outside, and then, as far as Kelsey could tell from the window, got into his car and drove somewhere he did not explain when he returned 2 hours later. She had not asked where he had gone. She already knew the kind of man she had married. She had known for a long time. What he didn't know, what he had never once thought to wonder, was the kind of woman who had been sitting quietly across from him at the breakfast table every morning for 3 years. He had spent those years looking at her and seeing ordinary. She had spent those years building a $44 billion answer to that assumption, and now in a hotel room 2 miles from a house that used to be hers, with Ren breathing softly against her chest and snow falling thick outside the window, the clock on that answer had finally begun to run. The story Claudette Weston told was elegant in its simplicity. She had perfected it by the second phone call, the one to Derek's aunt in Baltimore, the one where her voice carried just the right measure of reluctant grief, the kind that says, "I didn't want it to come to this," while meaning something else entirely. By the third call to the family friend who ran the social committee at their church, the story had acquired small details that made it feel true. By the weekend, it had traveled the full circumference of the Weston family's social world, and it went like this. Kelsey Brooks had been a troubled young woman from the beginning. Difficult, secretive. Not the kind of person who understood what it meant to be part of a family like theirs. There had been problems in the marriage for years. Derek had tried. Lord knows he had tried. And in the end, the separation had been mutual, amicable, and entirely for the best. Kelsey had chosen to leave. No one had made her do anything. The part about the snow was not mentioned. The part about the 6-day-old baby was not mentioned either. Kelsey heard the story third hand through a woman named Denise who had gone to church with the Westons for 20 years and felt apparently that Kelsey deserved to know what was being said about her. Denise called on a Wednesday morning, her voice hushed with the particular energy of someone delivering news they find both horrifying and irresistible. Kelsey listened to all of it without interrupting. When Denise finished, Kelsey said, "Thank you for telling me." Her voice was even, unhurried. She hung up, opened her laptop, and began a new document titled simply Record. Every conversation, every date, every specific claim Claudette had made, documented, time-stamped, cross-referenced against the camera footage she had already requested from the neighbor across Alderton Drive, whose security system faced the porch directly. She was not reacting. She was counting. The insurance cancellation arrived on a Friday. It came as a letter, formal, bureaucratic, the language of administrative violence dressed in the neutral vocabulary of policy management. Derek had removed Kelsey from his employer-sponsored health plan effective immediately. The letter cited change in dependent status. There was a number to call if she had questions. Wren had a pediatric cardiology follow-up scheduled for the following Tuesday. A precautionary appointment, the kind that followed a minor irregularity, flagged during the newborn screening at Mercy General, almost certainly nothing the neonatologist had said but worth monitoring. The kind of appointment that without insurance carried a cost that Kelsey could absorb without blinking, but that was in its deliberate cancellation, a specific and calculated cruelty. She stared at the letter for a long moment. Then she photographed it, emailed the image to Patricia, and texted 3 words. Add this too, Patricia replied in under a minute, already drafted. What Derek did not understand, what none of the Westons understood because they had constructed their entire understanding of Kelsey around the premise of her ordinariness, was that she had been in difficult rooms before, rooms where the people across the table had more resources, more connections, more history than she did. Rooms where the assumption was that she would fold or ask for too little or accept a settlement that reflected their estimation of her rather than the reality of what she had built. She had never folded in those rooms. She was not going to fold now. Derek called on a Saturday afternoon 9 days after the night on the porch. The call lasted 4 minutes. He spoke in the measured tone of a man who had rehearsed or been coached, probably both, and the substance of what he said was, the marriage had not been working for some time, they both knew it. A clean separation was in everyone's interest, including Wren's, and his lawyers would be in touch with a proposed agreement that was, he wanted her to know, very fair. Very fair. Kelsey sat on the edge of the hotel bed with Wren in her lap, listening to the word fair come out of the mouth of a man who had stood inside a warm house while she stood in the snow and felt something clarify inside her. Not anger, not grief, but something colder and more precise than either. I'll have Patricia reach out to your team, she said. That was all she said. She could hear in the silence before he hung up that he had expected more. An argument, perhaps. Tears. Some indication that she was struggling, that the ground beneath her was shifting, that she needed something from him. He had been waiting for her to reveal the shape of her desperation so he could calibrate his offer accordingly. She gave him nothing. The days that followed had a particular texture, quiet on the surface, dense with movement underneath. Kelsey established a routine at the extended stay that was in its own way a form of discipline. She nursed Wren at 5, worked from 6 to 8 while the baby slept, took her for the slow, careful walks that the postpartum recovery nurse had recommended, worked again in the afternoons with Wren in the carrier against her chest. She ate well. She slept when she could. She did not allow herself the luxury of catastrophizing. Patricia called every other day with updates that sounded to anyone who might have been listening like the careful reporting of a woman systematically building a structure that could bear an enormous amount of weight. The camera footage from the neighbor's security system had been secured clear time-stamped, showing Claudette setting the bags on the porch with deliberate efficiency while snow accumulated on the railing beside her. 3 of Derek's colleagues, it emerged, had received calls from Claudette in the days following the lockout calls in which she had described Kelsey's departure in terms that Patricia's team documented carefully as potentially defamatory. The insurance cancellation applied to a mother 6 days postpartum with an infant flagged for cardiac monitoring was, in Patricia's measured professional opinion, going to be very difficult for Derek's legal team to explain in front of a judge. They are proceeding, Patricia told her on a Tuesday evening, as though they are the only ones who have been preparing. Kelsey looked down at Wren, who was awake and studying the ceiling fan above the hotel bed with the focused intensity of someone encountering a miracle for the first time. Let them, Kelsey said. Claudette Weston had built her reputation on knowing always exactly who she was dealing with. In 35 years of navigating the social and familial architecture of the Weston name, she had sized up every woman who came within reach of her son and made her assessment with the swift, absolute confidence of someone who had never been wrong. She had looked at Kelsey Brooks and seen a woman without armor. She had been so certain. She had been so completely, catastrophically certain, and that certainty had made her bold, and that boldness had made her careless, and that carelessness had made her do things in front of a security camera and on recorded phone lines that she would spend the next several months wishing with increasing desperation that she could take back. But she couldn't. No one can unbolt a door they've already locked. No one can unstep from the snow they've already made someone stand in. And no one, not Claudette Weston, not Derek, not Tara, in her red dress, by the fireplace, had any idea that the woman they had dismissed was not counting down to a breakdown. She was counting down to Thursday. Patricia Wells had a rule about paperwork. Every document that mattered, every filing, every agreement, every letter that carried legal weight had to be read 3 times before it left her office. Once for accuracy, once for implication, once for the thing the other side would wish you hadn't noticed. It was a habit she had developed over 30 years of practice, and it had never once failed her. The file she was building for Kelsey Brooks was by any professional measure the most complete she had ever assembled. She spread it across the conference table on a Wednesday morning 14 days after the night on the porch and walked through it section by section with the methodical satisfaction of a woman who understood that justice, when it finally arrived, almost always arrived on paper first. Section 1, the prenuptial agreement. Derek James Weston had signed it on a Saturday afternoon in November, 3 weeks before the wedding, in the offices of a family attorney named Gerald Hutchins, who had been doing estate work for the Westons for 20 years, and who had, it was clear from the document's language, reviewed it primarily from the perspective of protecting the Weston family's existing assets, which were, Patricia had since established through routine research, considerably more modest than the family's social presentation suggested. The agreement was clean, specific, and from Kelsey's perspective, close to perfect. KBI Holdings, incorporated prior to the marriage, was designated as separate property in language that left no meaningful room for interpretation. Any appreciation in the company's value during the marriage remained separate. Any income Kelsey derived from KBI Holdings during the marriage remained separate. The structure reflected with quiet precision the advice Patricia had given her 4 years earlier: protect what you've built as though you already know how this ends. Derek had initialed every page. He had not read every page. Patricia allowed herself in the privacy of her conference room a small and professional satisfaction at that fact. Section 2, the documentation of the evening of January 14th. The security footage from the neighbor's camera system, a retired schoolteacher named Mr. Afalabi, who had installed the system after a package theft 2 winters ago, and who had handed over the footage with quiet, righteous indignation when Patricia's assistant explained what it showed, was 37 minutes long. It showed in clear and time-stamped detail Claudette Weston exiting the front door of the house on Alderton Drive at 7:43 p.m., carrying the first of 3 bags. It showed her placing them with deliberate neatness on the snow-covered porch. It showed her re-entering the house. It showed her returning twice more with additional items. It showed her testing the new lock at 7:58 p.m., a small, satisfied pull of the handle to confirm it held. It did not show Kelsey arriving because Kelsey had arrived at 8:14 p.m. after the camera's motion sensor had timed out. But it showed everything that had been prepared for her. Patricia labeled that section Exhibit A. Section 3, the insurance cancellation. Derek's legal team, Patricia had learned through professional channels, was planning to characterize the removal from the health plan as an administrative oversight, a clerical error made during a period of personal distress that would be promptly corrected. It was the kind of explanation that sounded reasonable in a hallway conversation and collapsed completely under documentation. Patricia had the original letter. She had the effective date. She had the pediatric cardiology appointment confirmation scheduled for 4 days after the cancellation took effect. She had the name of the neonatologist at Mercy General who had flagged the monitoring recommendation in Wren's discharge paperwork. She had additionally 3 text messages Derek had sent to his personal assistant in the 48 hours before the cancellation was processed, in which the words "take her off," everything appeared with a specificity that suggested something considerably more intentional than an oversight. Patricia labeled that section Exhibit B. Kelsey arrived at the office at noon. Wren in the infant carrier against her chest, a coffee in each hand. She set one in front of Patricia without being asked. They had been doing this long enough that the gesture required no explanation, and sat down across from the conference table. She looked at the file. She did not look at it the way someone looks at a weapon. She looked at it the way someone looks at something they built with the quiet recognition of a person reviewing their own work. "Walk me through the timeline," she said. Patricia did. 22 minutes. No interruptions. Kelsey listened with her eyes moving steadily across the documents, occasionally touching a page, to turn it occasionally pausing on a number or a date, with the focused attention of someone confirming what they already expected to find. When Patricia finished, Kelsey sat back. Wren stirred against her chest, made a small sound, settled again. "His team," Kelsey said. "What are they expecting?" Patricia folded her hands on the table. "They filed a standard asset disclosure request yesterday. Their investigators spent approximately 6 hours attempting to identify your financial holdings." She paused. "He found a checking account with $11,000, a 6-year-old vehicle, and a partial interest in a Mercer Street commercial lease that expired 14 months ago." Kelsey said nothing. "He called our office this morning." Patricia continued to confirm that the disclosure was complete. "What did you tell him? That we would respond through proper channels?" Patricia allowed the faintest elevation at the corner of her mouth. He sounded relieved. That afternoon, while Patricia's team finalized the response filing, Kelsey sat in the small waiting room of the pediatric cardiology department at Mercy General, the same hospital where Wren had been born, 16 days earlier, and filled out the new patient intake form with Wren's insurance information from her own KBI Holdings executive plan, which she had added the baby to 3 days after the lockout without telling anyone without drama as a matter of course. The cardiologist was a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Anand who examined Wren with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who took small things seriously. The irregularity she confirmed was minor, a small variation in the septal wall that she expected to resolve entirely within the first year. She would want to see Wren again in 3 months. "She's healthy," Dr. Anand said, returning the baby to Kelsey's arms. "Strong." Kelsey looked down at Wren's face, the wide, dark eyes, the mouth already searching, and felt something move through her chest that she didn't have a word for. Not relief exactly. Something larger than relief. Something that had been tightly coiled for 16 days, and now in this fluorescent-lit room that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air very slowly began to loosen. Derek's legal team filed their proposed settlement agreement that evening. It arrived in Patricia's inbox at 6:47 p.m., 43 pages, and its central premise, derived clearly from their investigators' 6 hours of fruitless research, was that Kelsey Brooks had no significant financial assets and was therefore entitled to a modest monthly support figure, shared custody structured around Derek's schedule, and a lump sum that amounted to slightly less than 2 years of a mid-level financial services salary. Patricia forwarded it to Kelsey with a single line of commentary. "They have no idea." Kelsey read it once, set her phone face down on the hotel nightstand, looked at Wren sleeping in the portable crib beside the bed chest, rising and falling small and steady, and entirely untroubled by the magnitude of what was coming. Derek's lawyers had spent the day searching for what she was worth and found nothing. They had been looking at all the wrong things. Thursday was still 8 days away. She turned off the light. Victor Osei was not a man who missed details. 58 years old, built like someone who had carried serious weight for a long time and learned to move carefully because of it, Victor had spent 3 decades constructing a mid-sized investment portfolio that was by any honest accounting more the result of patience and attention than brilliance. He was not the smartest man in any room he entered. He knew this about himself, had known it since his 30s, and had decided early that the most productive response to that knowledge was to listen more carefully than anyone else in the room and never under any circumstances sign something he hadn't read. He was sitting at the desk in his home office on a Thursday evening, working through the quarterly communications from his investment holdings when the email from KBI Holdings arrived. It was a standard investor relations communication, the kind that preceded a major public roadshow dance, with language about strategic partnerships and market positioning, and the transformative potential of AI-driven healthcare infrastructure. Victor had held a small position in KBI Holdings for 2 years, having been introduced to it by a colleague who described it as the kind of company that does the thing quietly, and then everyone wishes they'd paid attention sooner. He had reviewed the prospectus, found it rigorous, and invested a modest amount with the expectation of patience. He opened the email, scrolled past the executive summary, scrolled past the financial highlights, and then reached the section titled Leadership and the photograph beneath the name Kelsey Marie Brooks, founder and chief executive officer, and stopped. He looked at the photograph for a long time. He was a man who prided himself on his memory for faces. It was, in his experience, one of the more useful things a person could hold onto the specific geometry of a face, the way light sat differently on different kinds of features. He had a file of them in the back of his mind, organized without intention, reliable without effort. He had seen this face before, not in a boardroom, not at a conference, not in any of the professional contexts where a face like this, composed, precise, carrying the particular stillness of someone accustomed to being the most prepared person in the room, might reasonably have appeared. He had seen it in a photograph on his daughter's phone. 18 months ago, on a Sunday afternoon, Tara had shown him a picture of the man she was seeing, Derek Weston. She had said with the particular brightness in her voice that Victor had learned to receive carefully without reaction. "He's separated," she had said. "It's complicated, but it's real." In the background of the photograph, partially cut off at the edge of the frame, a woman had been standing at a kitchen counter with her back mostly turned, but her profile had been visible, and Victor, because he could not help it, had noted her. That profile, those locks, that particular angle of the jaw. He set the email down metaphorically because it was on a screen and sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then he picked up his phone and called Tara. She answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the easy warmth she reserved for him and almost no one else. "Dad, what's up?" "I need you to answer me something," Victor said. His voice was level, unhurried. The voice of a man who had decided to walk slowly toward a thing rather than run. "The man you've been seeing, Derek Weston?" A small pause. "Yes." "His wife. What do you know about her?" Another pause, longer this time, with a different quality, the kind of pause that meant she was deciding how much to say and to whom. "She's their separated dad. It's been done for a while. She wasn't— what is her name? Kelsey Brooks, I think. She kept her name." Something in Tara's tone shifted a faint defensiveness, the tone of someone who had told themselves a story often enough that outside questions felt like accusations. "Why?" Victor looked at the photograph on his screen again. "Because," he said slowly, "I want you to tell me whether you've ever heard of a company called KBI Holdings." The silence that followed was the longest yet. "No," Tara said. "I don't think so." "Why?" "Because," Victor said, "the woman whose marriage, your relationship, has been built on top of the woman Derek Weston's family locked out of her house 6 days after she gave birth, is the founder and CEO of the company that just closed a $44 billion deal." He paused, letting the number land at its own weight. "And I am one of her investors." The silence on the other end of the line was total, not the silence of confusion. The silence of someone standing very still while the floor rearranges itself beneath them. "Dad?" "I'm not calling to argue with you," Victor said. His voice was quiet, precise entirely, without drama. "I'm calling because you are my daughter, and I will not have you build your future on a foundation that is about to collapse. And I am telling you, Tara, what Derek Weston's family has done to that woman is going to come out. All of it. And when it does, everyone who was standing in that house celebrating is going to be standing in the light." He heard her breath catch. "I need you to think very carefully," he said, "about where you want to be standing." Tara Osi sat in the living room of the Alderton Drive house for a long time after the call ended. The fire was going. Derek was in the kitchen making the kind of relaxed domestic noise, cabinet doors running water, the low murmur of a sports broadcast of a man who believed the hardest part was already behind him. Claudette's engagement ring was on Tara's finger where it had been for 11 days, and she had grown accustomed to the weight of it, in the way you grow accustomed to things that feel significant before you understand what they cost. She looked at the ring. She looked at her phone. She opened a browser and typed KBI Holdings CEO. The results loaded in under a second. Forbes, Bloomberg, The Wall Street Journal, TechCrunch, a Financial Times profile from 8 months ago titled "The Architect of Invisible Infrastructure." A photograph, the same photograph from Victor's investor email, of Kelsey Brooks standing at a floor-to-ceiling window in what appeared to be a Singapore high-rise, the city spread out behind her in the early morning light, her expression carrying the specific calm of someone who has spent years being the only person in the room who knows exactly what is coming. Tara read for 11 minutes without stopping. Then she set her phone face down on the cushion beside her, carefully, deliberately, the way you set something down when you're trying not to let your hands show what they are feeling, and looked at the fire. Derek came in from the kitchen holding 2 glasses of wine, smiling the uncomplicated smile of a man who had recently Googled nothing of importance. He held a glass out to her. She looked at it. She looked at him. And for the first time since the night she had sat in this firelit room, in a red dress holding champagne that didn't belong to her, Tara Osi said absolutely nothing. Not because she had nothing to say, because she was for the first time genuinely afraid of what would happen when she did. The thing about a wall built on assumption is that it doesn't crack from the outside. It cracks from within, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the way a hairline fracture travels through concrete, not because something struck it hard, but because the weight it was never designed to carry has been pressing down on it quietly for longer than anyone noticed. And then one morning you look up and the line is there, and you understand with a cold and specific clarity that it has been there for a while. The Weston wall began cracking on a Friday morning. It started with Tara. She had been quiet since Thursday evening, a quietness Derek had initially read as tiredness then, as mood then, by Friday breakfast, as something he could no longer comfortably name. She sat across from him at the kitchen table with her coffee and said nothing about the day's plans. Nothing about the venue deposit. She had been pressing him to confirm, nothing about the conversation with her mother she had mentioned wanting to have about the wedding timelines. She just sat and looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before, not coldness exactly, not anger, but the particular focused stillness of someone in the process of revising a decision they thought they had already made. Derek, who was not a man accustomed to reading rooms that had turned against him, tried twice to restart the morning's easy rhythm, a comment about the weather, a question about her plans for the afternoon, and received answers so brief and so carefully neutral that they told him nothing and everything simultaneously. He left for the office unsettled in a way he couldn't articulate. By noon, Tara had called him. He was in a meeting, or rather, he stepped out of a meeting, because when Tara called, he had for the past several weeks made a habit of answering immediately with the attentive generosity of a man who understood that the thing he was building with her required maintenance. "I need to ask you something," she said. Her voice was different on the phone than it had been at breakfast, more direct, less careful. "Of course," he said. He moved further down the hallway away from the glass-walled conference room. "What is it, Kelsey Brooks?" A pause. "Your wife." Something shifted in his chest, a small involuntary tightening. "We've talked about this. The situation is she the CEO of KBI Holdings?" The hallway went very quiet. Derek's mind moved quickly through several responses, denial, deflection, the calm and reasonable reframing he had used successfully in many difficult conversations, and discarded each of them in the half-second it took him to register that the way Tara had asked the question meant she already knew the answer. "Where did you hear that?" he said. "My father," Tara said. "He's an investor." Another pause, and in the pause Derek could hear the specific texture of a woman choosing her next words with extreme precision. "Derek, did you know?" The question was simple. The answer was simpler. "No," he said, which was true, and which was in that moment the most catastrophically inadequate true thing he had ever said. He Googled her name at 12:23 p.m., sitting in his car in the parking structure beneath his office building with the engine off and the phone screen the only light. Kelsey Brooks, KBI Holdings. The results came back in 0.43 seconds. He stared at the screen for a long time. Forbes profile. Bloomberg Intelligence Report. A TechCrunch piece from 3 years ago. 3 years ago, when she had been living in the spare room, he had twice suggested converting into a nursery titled "The Woman Quietly Rebuilding American Healthcare from the Ground Up." A Wall Street Journal piece from 8 months ago. A Financial Times interview he could access only the first 3 paragraphs of before it asked him to subscribe, but the 3 paragraphs were enough. "I don't talk much about my process," Kelsey had told the FT journalist. "I find that the work speaks with considerably more authority than I do." He scrolled. He kept scrolling. There were photographs, not many, because she had clearly and deliberately limited her public presence, but enough. Kelsey in a Singapore conference room. Kelsey at a healthcare infrastructure summit in Zurich. Kelsey shaking hands with a hospital network CEO whose name Derek recognized from the financial news. Kelsey at a podium somewhere, not smiling for the camera, just speaking entirely focused, entirely present, entirely unaware of or uninterested in the impression she was making. He had eaten breakfast across from this woman for 3 years. He had described her at a client dinner 14 months ago as, "My wife, she does some tech consulting, nothing too demanding." He put the phone face down on the passenger seat. He sat in the dark of the parking structure with his hands on his knees and tried to locate somewhere in the architecture of the last 3 years the moment he might have known. The moment something might have indicated, if he had been paying any attention at all, that the woman he had married was not who he had decided she was. He found nothing. Not because the signs hadn't been there, because he had never looked. He called his mother from the parking structure at 12:51 p.m. Claudette answered on the first ring, as she always did when Derek called a habit born of decades of being the person he turned to first when something needed to be managed. He told her what he had found. The silence that followed was unlike any silence Derek had heard from his mother in 35 years of knowing her. Claudette Weston was a woman who moved through uncertainty with the confident momentum of someone who had already decided the outcome, who filled silences rather than inhabiting them, who produced responses the way other people produce breath automatically without apparent effort. This silence lasted 11 seconds. Derek counted. "How much?" Claudette said finally. Her voice had a quality he had never heard in it before, not quite fear, but the immediate neighbor of fear, the thing that lives in the house next door and shares a wall. $44 billion, Derek said. The deal closed the day Wren was born. Another silence. "She was in the hospital," Claudette said almost to herself. "She was in the hospital and she signed it," Derek said. Yes. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew, sitting in their separate silences in the middle of a Friday that had started so ordinarily, was that in saying those words out loud, Claudette had just done something that would matter enormously in approximately 9 days. She had begun without realizing it to rehearse a confession. The particular cadence of "she was in the hospital" and "she spoken aloud" in that tone, with that specific combination of realization and self-incrimination, was a sentence that once practiced had a tendency to come back at the worst possible moment. Patricia Wells could have told her that, but no one had thought to ask Patricia Wells anything yet. That evening, Derek sat in the living room of the Alderton Drive house, the house that was he now understood with a slow and nauseating certainty, entirely purchased with his family's money and therefore entirely vulnerable in whatever was coming, and looked at Tara across the coffee table. She had come back. He wasn't sure why. Maybe she didn't know yet either. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, the engagement ring catching the firelight, her face carrying that new expression, the revised one, the one that had replaced the easy confidence of 11 days ago with something considerably more careful. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Derek looked at the fire. He thought about the prenuptial agreement he had signed on a Saturday afternoon without reading it. He thought about 3 years of breakfasts across from a woman whose name generated 847,000 search results. He thought about the parking structure and the phone screen, and the 0.43 seconds it had taken the internet to tell him everything he should have already known. "I don't know," he said. It was in its honesty the most accurate thing he had said in years, but honest didn't mean safe. And Thursday was still coming whether he was ready for it or not. There is a specific kind of power that most people never learn to use. Not the power of volume, of speaking loudest, of filling rooms with the force of your presence, of making sure everyone within range understands what you are capable of. That kind of power is common. It is also, in Kelsey's experience, the kind most easily mistaken for strength by people who have never had to build anything from nothing. The kind she had spent 7 years learning was quieter than that. It was the power of stillness, of knowing exactly what you have and choosing precisely and deliberately when to show it. Of understanding that the most unsettling thing you can do to someone who expects you to react is to simply not. She had been practicing it her entire adult life. She was practicing it now. Derek called on a Monday morning 6 days before the hearing. Patricia had advised her to let it go to voicemail, and Kelsey had agreed, but she picked up anyway, not out of weakness and not out of any remaining tenderness for the man on the other end of the line, but because she wanted to hear one last time the specific quality of his voice when he believed he still had leverage he no longer possessed. He had clearly prepared. The cadence was measured, the vocabulary careful, the language of a man who had either spoken to a therapist or rehearsed in front of a mirror, possibly both. He was sorry, he said. The situation had gotten out of hand. His mother had acted in ways he hadn't sanctioned, which was, Kelsey noted, the first time in 3 years of marriage she had heard him apply any qualification whatsoever to something Claudette had done. He wanted to talk. He wanted to find a resolution that worked for both of them for Wren's sake, something that didn't have to become, and here his voice tightened almost imperceptibly, a public matter. That last phrase, a public matter. She heard beneath it exactly what it was, a man who had spent the weekend reading about his wife on the internet, and understood now that the story of what his family had done was not a private story anymore, that it had dimensions he had not anticipated, that the woman he had expected to negotiate from desperation was going to walk into that hearing room with something he could not outbid and could not charm away and could not reframe with careful vocabulary. She let him finish. Then she said quietly, "Have your team call Patricia." She hung up. Claudette came on a Wednesday. She arrived at the extended stay hotel at 11 in the morning without calling ahead, which was, Kelsey reflected, entirely consistent with a woman who had spent 62 years operating under the assumption that her arrival was always welcome. The front desk called up. Kelsey, who was nursing Wren in the armchair by the window, with a contract review open on the laptop beside her, considered for a moment. Then she said, "Send her up." Claudette looked smaller in the hotel hallway than she had ever looked in her own house. It was the first thing Kelsey noticed, not smaller physically, but smaller in the particular way of people whose authority is entirely contextual, who are formidable only within the architecture they have built around themselves, and who, removed from that architecture, become something closer to ordinary. She was wearing her good coat. Her hair was pinned back as precisely as always, but her hands, Kelsey noticed, were not entirely still. Kelsey opened the door wider and stepped back without speaking. Claudette entered. She looked at the room, modest, functional, the portable crib in the corner, the evidence of a woman living carefully and without complaint in a space that was nothing like what she deserved, and something moved across her face that was not quite guilt, but was guilt's first cousin. She sat in the chair Kelsey gestured toward. She folded her hands. And then Claudette Weston, who had spent 35 years never being the one to apologize, apologized. It was not a good apology. It was the apology of someone who understood that an apology was strategically necessary, rather than the apology of someone who had genuinely reckoned with what they had done. It contained the word perhaps 3 times the phrase, in hindsight twice, and an extended passage about how much stress the family had been under that Kelsey listened to without expression. She waited until Claudette finished. Then she said very quietly, "You put me outside in January snow with a 6-day-old baby. You changed the locks on a house I had lived in for 3 years. You told people in your community that I had abandoned my marriage." She paused. "You should have thought about all of that before you did it, not after." Claudette opened her mouth. Kelsey continued, her voice unchanged. "I'm not interested in an apology right now, Claudette. I'm interested in what happens on Thursday. And what happens on Thursday is entirely in Patricia's hands." She stood. The conversation was over. Claudette left the way she had arrived, without the script she had prepared, without the resolution she had come for, with her hands slightly less steady than they had been in the hallway. Patricia called that evening with the final confirmation. The hearing was set for 9 a.m., Thursday, at the offices of Hargrove and Bell, a firm whose downtown address carried in the world of high-asset divorce proceedings a specific gravity that Derek's team had presumably chosen for its impressiveness, and that, what Patricia noted with professional satisfaction, served Kelsey's purposes equally well. "Victor Osei has confirmed he will attend," Patricia said, "as a material witness to the business valuation timeline." "Good," Kelsey said. "Derek's team filed a supplemental asset inquiry this afternoon. They are still—" Patricia paused with the measured restraint of a woman choosing not to say what she was thinking, "operating under certain assumptions about the scope of your holdings." "I know. They will not be operating under those assumptions after 9:15 Thursday morning." Kelsey was quiet for a moment. Through the window of the hotel room, the city moved in its ordinary evening rhythm. Headlights, the distant sound of a siren, the unremarkable passage of a world that had no idea what was 24 hours from happening, in a conference room on the 14th floor of a downtown office building. "How is she?" Patricia asked. It was the question she always asked at the end of their calls now, not about the case, not about the documents, but about Wren. It was Kelsey had come to understand Patricia's way of remembering what all of it was actually for. "She smiled today," Kelsey said. "A real one, not gas." Patricia made a sound that was as close to warmth as her professional register allowed. "Good. Get some rest." That night, Kelsey laid out her clothes for Thursday. A white blazer tailored, structured, the kind of garment that communicated nothing except absolute composure over a soft cream blouse. Simple earrings, her locks down the way she wore them when she wanted to feel entirely like herself, rather than a version of herself curated for other people's comfort. She didn't iron the blazer out of nerves. She ironed it out of habit, the same habit she had developed years ago in the early days of KBI Holdings, when she had learned that the discipline of small preparations was the thing that kept you steady in rooms where everyone was waiting for you to show a crack. She hung it on the back of the bathroom door. She checked on Wren asleep steady, entirely untroubled. She turned off the light, and in the morning she would walk into a room where the people who had locked her out in the snow were waiting to tell her what she was worth. She already knew what she was worth. She had known for 7 years. Tomorrow they were finally going to find out. The 14th floor of Hargrove and Bell smelled of leather and climate-controlled air and the particular silence of a building that handled serious money seriously. Kelsey arrived at 8:47. She signed in at the reception desk, accepted the visitor badge the assistant offered, and took a seat in the waiting area without looking toward the elevator bank, where she could hear distantly the sound of Derek's voice. Lower than usual, compressed the voice of a man performing composure for an audience that wasn't buying it. Patricia sat beside her leather portfolio, open across her knees, reviewing the final page of a document she had already read 14 times and would read once more before 9 o'clock because that was simply how Patricia operated. Wren was with a woman named Dolores, a retired pediatric nurse Patricia had quietly arranged because Patricia arranged everything quietly in the hotel room 2 miles away. Kelsey had fed her at 6, held her for 20 minutes longer than necessary, and then placed her in Dolores's arms with the specific practiced steadiness of a woman who understood that falling apart was a luxury she would allow herself later in private when all of this was finished. She straightened the lapel of her white blazer. She looked at nothing in particular. She was ready. The conference room at Hargrove and Bell was large enough to feel significant, without being large enough to feel theatrical. A long mahogany table, high-backed chairs, a wall of windows overlooking the downtown skyline, in the flat gray light of a February morning. Someone had placed water glasses at each seat. Someone had arranged legal pads and pens with the automatic hospitality of a space that processed human conflict daily and had learned to make it comfortable. Derek was already seated when Kelsey entered. He looked up when she walked in, and for a fraction of a second before his expression rearranged itself into the careful neutrality his attorneys had presumably advised she saw it. The thing she had been waiting without realizing it to see. Not guilt, not remorse, but something more fundamental than either the specific disorientation of a man who had spent 3 years constructing an image of someone and was now sitting 12 feet away from the reality of her and finding that the distance between the two was larger than any room could contain. He looked away first. His attorneys, 2 men in dark suits whose names Kelsey did not bother to memorize, arranged their documents with brisk efficiency. Claudette was seated against the wall to Derek's right in the chair reserved for supporting parties, wearing the champagne dress she saved for occasions she considered important. Her hands were folded on her lap. Her posture was impeccable. Her eyes, when they met, Kelsey's moved away quickly. Victor Osei entered at 8:58, acknowledged Patricia with a brief nod, and took the seat beside her without ceremony. He set a single manila folder on the table in front of him, aligned it precisely with the table's edge, and folded his hands on top of it. He did not look at Tara, who was not in the room. Had not been in the room, Kelsey understood, since the night she had set her phone face down on the couch cushion, and looked at the fire and made a calculation. The mediator, a woman named Judge Harriet Cole, retired, whose reputation in high-asset dissolution proceedings was considerable, entered at exactly 9 o'clock and called the room to order with the efficient warmth of someone who had presided over enough of these mornings to understand that efficiency was its own form of mercy. The first 40 minutes were procedural, disclosures, filings, the careful sequential presentation of documents that both sides had already reviewed in the formal language of a process designed to ensure that nothing significant could later be claimed to have arrived without warning. Derek's team presented their asset summary: his holdings, his pension, his stake in the financial services firm, the family property on Alderton Drive. Patricia received each document and set it aside with the unhurried attention of someone who knew that the order of the morning still had considerable distance to travel. Derek's lead attorney, the taller of the two, whose name Kelsey would later recall as something with 2 syllables beginning with a vowel, then turned to the matter of Kelsey's disclosed assets. He summarized them efficiently: the checking account, the vehicle, the expired Mercer Street lease interest. He described the prenuptial agreement as straightforward and binding. He outlined the proposed settlement in terms that were, he said, generous given the circumstances, and he used the word fair twice, which Kelsey noted without expression. He concluded by stating that his client was prepared to finalize the agreement that morning, subject to confirmation that the disclosed assets were complete and accurate. He looked at Patricia. Patricia looked at him. She opened her portfolio. For the record, Patricia said, her voice carrying the particular quality of someone who has been waiting a long time to say a specific sentence and has decided to say it without any additional preparation, I'd like to introduce into disclosure the complete asset profile of Kelsey Marie Brooks. She slid a document across the table. Derek's lead attorney picked it up. He read the first page. Something happened to his face, a subtle, involuntary rearrangement, the kind that happens when the information a face is processing does not match the framework the brain has been using to interpret the morning. He turned to page 2. His colleague leaned over and read alongside him, and the 2 men sat for a moment in the particular stillness of people who have just discovered that the room they are in is a different room than the one they thought they entered. Victor Osei opened his manila folder and placed a single-page document on the table, a signed confirmation from his investment firm of K-Buy Holdings' valuation as of the date of the $44 billion deal closing. He pushed it toward the center of the table without comment. Derek's attorney cleared his throat. He said, KBI Holdings valued at, he stopped, tried again, valued at $44 billion. He set the document down. Solely owned by another pause, and in the pause the room became very quiet, the kind of quiet that has masked Kelsey Marie Brooks prior to marriage, protected under the prenuptial agreement signed by Derek James Weston on November the 4th. Derek made a sound. Not a word, not a coherent sound. Something that began as a word and didn't finish a syllable that started in his chest and dissolved before it reached his mouth. His hands flat on the table, pressed down as though he needed the surface to confirm that it was still there. He did not look at Kelsey. He stared at the document in front of him with the expression of a man watching something he cannot stop and cannot look away from. It was Claudette who broke the silence. Later, Patricia would describe it as the most expensive 6 seconds of Claudette Weston's life. Later, the recording, because Judge Cole's proceedings were recorded as standard practice, a detail that Derek's team had either forgotten or not considered relevant, would play those 6 seconds back with a clarity that left no room for reinterpretation. Claudette leaned forward in her chair. Her voice, when it came, had the specific quality of a woman whose careful composure had finally encountered something it was not built to hold cracking, not with grief, not with remorse, but with the unguarded outrage of someone who believed even now that the injustice was being done to her. I knew she was hiding something, Claudette said. Her voice was clear, distinct, entirely audible to everyone in the room and to the recording equipment on the credenza behind Judge Cole. That is exactly why I told Derek to get rid of her. The room went absolutely still. Judge Cole looked at Claudette over the top of her glasses with an expression that contained in its restraint an entire verdict. Patricia wrote one word on her legal pad, underlined it twice, and turned it fractionally so that Kelsey could read it. Exhibit C. Tara's chair against the wall was empty. No one had watched her leave. She had simply at some point between the opening of Patricia's portfolio and the reading of the $44 billion figure stood up, gathered her coat from the back of the chair, and walked out of the conference room with the quiet, purposeful movement of a woman who had made a calculation and was already acting on it. The door had closed behind her without a sound. Derek looked at the empty chair. Then he looked across the table at Kelsey, at the woman who had stood in the snow in January with his 6-day-old daughter, who had ironed her white blazer the night before out of habit, rather than nerves, who had spent 7 years building something the world was now taking seriously, and for the first time in 3 years of marriage, Derek Weston had absolutely nothing to say. Kelsey looked back at him. Her expression was not triumphant. It was not cold. It was something quieter and more complete than either the expression of a woman who had waited a long time for a room to finally tell the truth, and was now simply letting it. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The room had already said everything. The thing about a carefully constructed life built on other people's diminishment is that it requires constant maintenance. Every assumption has to be reinforced. Every narrative has to be retold. Every person in the peripheral architecture of that life, the colleagues, the family friends, the social circle that forms the audience for the performance, has to continue believing the version of events they were given, because the moment one person stops believing, the whole structure becomes vulnerable to the weight of what it was actually built on. The Weston family structure had been maintained for years by the collective agreement of people who either didn't know better or found it convenient not to. After Thursday, that agreement dissolved. Not loudly, not all at once. The way these things actually happen quietly by degrees. One phone call and one unanswered message and one professional door closing softly at a time. Victor Ose moved first. He was by nature and by practice a man who acted on decisions once he had made them without the prolonged deliberation that some people mistook for wisdom, but which he had long recognized as simply the discomfort of doing something that needed to be done. He had made his decision on the drive home from the 14th floor of Hargrove and Bell, with the city moving past the car windows, in the flat gray February light, and the recording of Claudette Weston's 6 seconds playing back in his memory with the precise, unambiguous clarity of something that had been said in a room full of witnesses. He called the managing partner of his investment firm from his home office that evening. He withdrew formally and with full documentation every professional and financial connection the Ose family held with the Weston network, 3 referral relationships, 2 shared board memberships in community organizations, and a standing invitation to the Weston family's annual spring gathering that had been for 11 years an event Victor had attended out of a social obligation he now understood he had no further reason to honor. He did this without drama, without a public statement, without any of the performative righteousness that people sometimes used to signal virtue rather than actually exercising it. He simply stopped. And in the specific interconnected world of the city's Black professional community, where relationships were currency and associations were visible, and the withdrawal of someone like Victor Ose from a network carried weight that no press release could replicate, that stopping was noticed, immediately understood quickly, and communicated without anyone having to say anything directly. Derek's firm called him on a Monday, not his direct supervisor, which would have been uncomfortable enough, but the senior managing director, which was a level of seriousness that could not be reframed as anything other than what it was. The conversation lasted 14 minutes, and its substance distilled to its essential elements was this: the details of the divorce proceedings had been reviewed. The public profile of Kelsey Brooks had been reviewed. The recording of certain statements made during the mediation, which had reached the firm through channels that Derek's team had apparently not anticipated, had been reviewed. The firm had a public commitment to values of equity and integrity in both its professional conduct and its associations with leadership. Derek's position was effective immediately under formal review. He drove home from that meeting along the same route he had driven every weekday for 4 years, past the dry cleaner on the corner of 9th, past the coffee shop, where he had sometimes stopped on Friday mornings, past the park, where he had once told Kelsey on a Sunday walk that he barely remembered now that he thought they were building something real. He drove past all of it without seeing any of it, his hands on the wheel, his mind moving through the architecture of the last 3 weeks, trying to locate the single decision that had started all of this. He kept arriving at the same door, The one his mother had locked on a January evening while snow accumulated on the porch railing, and the woman inside carried $44 billion and a 6-day-old daughter and the entire quiet weight of a patience he had never once thought to take seriously. He sat in the driveway of the Alderton Drive house for a long time before going inside. Tara had been gone for 5 days by then. She had left her key on the kitchen counter, not dramatically, not with a note, just placed it there, with the simple finality of someone completing an administrative task, and had returned to her parents' house in the north of the city, where Victor had said nothing further about the matter because he understood, and Tara understood, that everything necessary had already been said. The engagement ring had been left as well. On the kitchen counter beside the key in its velvet box, Claudette's pearl and diamond ring, the one described as reserved for a woman worthy of the Weston family, sitting in the empty kitchen of a house that was becoming day by day a place that only one person still believed in. Claudette found it on a Tuesday morning. She stood at the kitchen counter and looked at the ring for a long time, and what moved across her face in those minutes was something that her son, had he been there to see, it might not have recognized because it was an expression Claudette Weston had very rarely allowed herself. It was the expression of a woman beginning for the first time to understand the full weight of what she had set in motion on a January evening with a new key and 3 neatly arranged bags. She picked up the ring. She put it in her pocket. She did not put it back on display. Patricia filed the civil damages claim on a Wednesday 3 weeks after Thursday. The claim was precise, thoroughly documented, and built on 3 pillars: the deliberate lockout of a postpartum woman and her newborn in winter conditions, the intentional cancellation of health insurance, covering an infant flagged for cardiac monitoring, and the campaign of defamatory statements made to third parties in the weeks following the lockout. Each pillar was supported by evidence that had been gathered with the quiet, patient diligence of a woman who had spent 7 years understanding that the difference between justice and outcome was almost always documentation. Claudette received the filing through her own attorneys on a Thursday morning, exactly 4 weeks after the morning that had changed everything, and sat in her kitchen reading through it with the slow, methodical attention of someone who was no longer able to afford the luxury of not reading carefully. Her attorneys advised her unanimously to settle. She did not argue. In the weeks that followed Thursday, something shifted in the way the city talked about Kelsey Brooks. It was not the story of a divorce. It was not the story of a betrayal or a revelation, or a woman scorned the vocabulary that people reached for reflexively when they tried to fit what had happened into a shape they already knew. It was something that didn't have a clean name because it was simply the story of a woman who had been seen incorrectly by the people closest to her and had been proved right by the things she had spent 7 years building. The Financial Times ran a follow-up profile. Bloomberg ran a longer piece, the kind with a photograph and a pull quote, that described Kelsey as the most consequential figure in healthcare infrastructure that most of the industry failed to notice until the industry could no longer afford to. She gave no additional interviews. She did not respond to the coverage either to accept it or to deflect it. She simply continued doing what she had always done, working, building, moving forward with the focused steadiness of someone whose identity had never required an audience to confirm it. Derek saw the Bloomberg piece on a Friday afternoon on his phone in the spare bedroom of his mother's house, where he had been staying since the formal review, at his firm concluded with a separation agreement that his own attorneys described with careful professionalism as the best outcome available under the circumstances. He read the pull quote 3 times. "I don't talk much about my process. The work speaks with considerably more authority than I do." He set the phone down. Outside the window, the city moved in its ordinary Friday evening rhythm, unhurried, indifferent to the specific dimensions of any one person's reckoning, entirely uninterested in whether the people it contained had learned anything from the things that had happened to them. Derek sat in the spare bedroom of his mother's house and tried to think of a single meeting in the last 3 years that Kelsey had ever asked him to attend on her behalf. He could not think of one, not because there hadn't been any, because he had never been paying enough attention to notice. Spring came to the city the way it always does, not announced, not dramatic, but present one morning in the quality of the light through the window, in the particular warmth that arrives before you have consciously registered that the cold is gone. Kelsey noticed it on a Tuesday. She was sitting at the desk in her office on the 31st floor of the KBI Holdings building, the office she had moved into 6 weeks after Thursday, when the company's public profile had expanded sufficiently that operating from a hotel room and a second-hand desk on Mercer Street had become, Patricia had gently observed, no longer entirely practical. The office was not large. She had furnished it with the same considered simplicity. She applied to everything a clean desk, 2 chairs, a shelf of books. She had actually read a small wooden mobile of tiny birds that she had taken from the nursery on Alderton Drive the morning she collected her things. The same mobile she had hung above Wren's crib in a room painted sage green. It turned slowly in the draft from the heating vent, and the birds, hand-carved, each one slightly different from the others, caught the morning light and held it briefly before releasing it over and over in a rhythm that had nothing to do with urgency. Wren was asleep in the portable crib in the corner of the office. 3 months old now, and changed in all the ways that 3 months changes a person who is still new to being a person rounder, more present, more convinced of her own significance in any room she occupied. She had Kelsey's eyes. Everyone who saw her said so, the wide, dark expressiveness of them, the way they moved across a face or a room, with the deliberate attention of someone who had already decided to take the world seriously. She slept with one fist loosely curled beside her cheek, her breathing steady, her small chest rising and falling, with the complete and uncomplicated peace of someone who had not yet learned to carry anything she didn't need. Kelsey watched her for a long moment, then she turned back to the window. The city below was beginning its Tuesday morning the particular choreography of a downtown coming-awake delivery trucks and early commuters, and the slow accumulation of ordinary movement that would build by 9 o'clock into the full rhythm of a working day. She had watched this from various windows at various hours for years, from the Mercer Street office in the early days, from hotel rooms during travel, from the spare bedroom of a temporary life she had been living for longer than she had admitted to herself. This window felt different. Not because the city had changed, but because the person looking out of it had finished something, had set down something she had been carrying for so long that the absence of its weight had taken weeks to feel like itself rather than like loss. She was not done building. She would never be done building. That was simply the nature of who she was, and she had stopped some years ago expecting herself to be otherwise. The Singapore rollout was 3 months from completion. There were 2 hospital networks in the Midwest in active conversations. A London office was being staffed quietly and carefully the way she staffed everything. The work continued, but the weight, the specific, particular weight of a life lived in deliberate invisibility, of a woman moving through her own existence at a careful distance from the people who should have known her, that weight was gone. She noticed its absence the way you notice the absence of a sound you have lived with for so long that you stopped hearing it suddenly, completely in the middle of an ordinary moment. She opened the drawer on the left side of her desk. Inside was a photograph, not framed, not displayed, simply kept. She had taken it herself on her phone on the morning she had left the hotel for the last time. It was a photograph of the view from the hotel room window, the parking lot in the early light, a gray sky, the edge of the city visible beyond the low roofline, and in the foreground, barely in frame, the corner of the portable crib that had held Wren for 43 nights. It was not a beautiful photograph. It was not the kind of photograph people kept for aesthetic reasons. She kept it because it was true, because it was the record of a period in her life that she intended to remember clearly, without the softening that time applied to difficult things, whether you asked it to or not. She intended to remember the hotel room and the parking lot and the 43 nights and the prenup Derek had signed without reading and the snow on the porch railing and the sound of laughter through a locked door. Not to stay there, but to know with certainty where she had come from. She looked at the photograph for a moment. Then she put it back in the drawer. Patricia called at 9:15, as she did most mornings, a brief call, operational rather than emotional, the kind of check-in that 2 women who had worked together for years conducted with the efficient warmth of people who no longer needed to explain their shorthand to each other. The civil claim against Claudette had settled the previous week quietly on terms that Patricia described as appropriate and that Kelsey had reviewed once signed and not discussed further. The divorce had been finalized 10 days ago, the prenuptial agreement holding precisely as it had been written to hold the $44 billion remaining exactly where it had always been in the company Kelsey had incorporated on a Thursday morning in March 7 years ago above a dry cleaning shop on Mercer Street, with a second-hand desk and a conviction that the world had a problem worth solving. Singapore confirmed the Q2 timeline, Patricia said. Good. The FT wants a follow-up interview. I told them you'd consider it. I'll think about it. A brief pause. Then Patricia said in a slightly different register, How are you? It was the question that existed outside the portfolio, outside the filings, outside the 30 years of professional distance that Patricia maintained with almost everyone except apparently Kelsey. She asked it at the end of most calls now with the directness of a woman who had decided at some point in the last 3 months that the asking mattered. Kelsey looked across the office at Wren, still asleep, the mobile turning slowly above her in the morning light. Good, she said, and meant it completely without qualification in the way that good sometimes means something larger than the word itself can hold. Good, Patricia said. After the call, Kelsey sat for a while without opening anything. No laptop, no documents, no dashboard or integration timeline or quarterly projection. Just the office and the light and the mobile turning above her daughter and the city moving below the window in its ordinary, unremarkable rhythm. She thought briefly about the woman who had stood in the snow on a January evening, the woman who had looked up at a lit window and felt something go very still inside her and made a decision so quiet it barely registered as a decision at all. The decision not to knock again, not to ask again, not to make herself smaller one more time in hopes that the door would open for her. She had not known standing there exactly what came next. She had known only that she was done waiting for permission to be who she already was. That had been enough. That had, in the end, been everything. Wren stirred. A small sound, not distress, not hunger, but the particular sound of a person waking gradually into the world, testing the air, deciding whether it was worth opening her eyes for. Kelsey pushed back from the desk, crossed the office in 4 steps, and lifted her daughter from the crib with the practiced ease of a woman who had done this hundreds of times, and still found each time that the weight of her was precisely as remarkable as it had been the first time. Wren opened her eyes. She looked up at her mother with the wide, unhurried attention that was already at 3 months entirely her own taking, in the face above her with the focused calm of someone encountering something familiar and choosing again to trust it. And then she smiled. A real one. Not gas. Kelsey held her daughter against her chest, stood at the window above the city, and looked out at the morning, at the light on the buildings, and the ordinary movement below, and the wide, unhurried sky above all of it, and felt running through her like something finally set down in exactly the right place, the specific and irreducible piece of a woman who had built what she came to build and protected what she came to protect, and asked in the end for nothing except the space to be exactly who she was. Strength isn't loud. It's the woman who stood in the snow and decided quietly, completely, without witnesses, that she would never beg for a door to be opened again. It never needed to be. She had always had the key. There is something the world rarely tells women who are in the middle of their hardest season. It doesn't tell them that the silence they are keeping might not be weakness, it might be architecture, that the invisibility others impose on them might become in the hands of the right woman a kind of shelter, that the door locked against them might one day turn out to have been the door to a room they no longer needed. Kelsey Brooks was not extraordinary because she had $44 billion. She was extraordinary because she understood long before anyone gave her permission to understand it that her worth was not determined by the people who failed to see it. She built in silence not because she was afraid to be seen, but because she knew with the patient certainty of someone who had done the work that the right moment would come, that the truth properly constructed and carefully protected does not require a loud room to survive in. If you are standing in the snow tonight, if you are outside a door that should be open to you holding something precious in the cold, know this. The silence you are keeping may be the most powerful thing about you. Keep building. The door was never the point. You were.